Please welcome to the stage David Hutchins, Senior Industry Analyst at Forecast International.
So I am David Hutchins, Senior Industry Analyst for Forecast International, and it's my privilege today to go through a couple slides on the Pentagon's research and development, or RDT&E funding, for all of you to discuss funding for a lot of the really interesting topics that have come up today. A quick word about Forecast International and who we are and what we're doing here. So we're actually part of the broader GovExec family as well. We partner with Defense One, and Forecast International is an over 50-year-old market research company that forecasts the aerospace and defense industry. So we look at air systems, land, naval, and space systems. We forecast out those production lines. And we also look at international military markets as well. But enough about Forecast International. What I'm going to talk to you about today, we're going to cover quite a few things in a short amount of time. But to start, we're going to talk about how RDT&E funding compares to procurement. We're going to look at that over time. We're also going to look at funding by service, who's getting how much money and when. We're going to talk about how the percentage has changed compared to historical funding and future funding. We're going to talk about RDT&Es by categories. What are the top categories that are receiving the most funding? We're going to look at top line items by service. And last, but of course not least, we're going to touch on some key funding for emerging technology that's coming down the pipe. Okay, so this is the first of several charts I have for you today. What this chart is looking at is procurement versus research and development funding over time. So at Forecast, we like to look back 10 years, and we like to look forward 10 years as well. So the beginning of this chart, you can see FY15, we're going back 10 years, and then we're looking at data from the government all the way out to FY29. So that orange dotted line, that is your procurement funding, and the solid blue line, that is your research and development funding. Now, if you take a look at this slide, the first thing you're going to notice is the trend is generally upward, and that's to be expected, right? We are investing in a lot of really interesting technologies and then trying to procure those technologies as we compete with other revisionist powers like, say, Russia and China. Now, one key takeaway from this slide that I want you to look at is around the FY24 mark. You're actually going to see that blue line dip a little bit. You might wonder, why is that? Well, that's generally the idea, is that funding is shifting from research to procurement in this transition period, as some of these technologies that are advancing are going to shift towards more of procurement dollars. Some examples of that are going to be the B-21 bomber. You may have heard of that. Columbia-class submarines, or next generation air defense, NGAD, if you've ever heard of that. Okay, so another chart here. I know it looks like we use Skittles to color these, but I promise there's a reason behind that. We wanted to show the difference in this RDT&E funding by service. So again, same timeline. We're looking back 10 years, forward 5 years. This is that same blue bar, but broken down by service. Now, at the top in that orange color, you're going to see that's defense-wide. That purple that appears around FY21, that's the Space Force. Welcome to the party. If you look at the light blue, that is Air Force, again, getting the majority of the funding there. And then in that navy color, guess what branch that is? That's the Navy and the Marine Corps. We don't want to forget about them. And Army green at the bottom there. So key takeaway from this slide, Space Force and Air Force combined together make up a large part of that funding moving forward and historically as well. Now that light blue color, that does include some classified pass-through funding that even I don't know what it is, but if you were to take that out, the Air Force is still the biggest recipient, past and future, of that RDT&E funding. There we go. Okay. So this slide is actually kind of a continuation of the previous slide. And what this is showing is we're looking at compound annual growth rates, as the chart says. So that change over time for our historical data, and then compare that to our future data. Now, you'll notice that there's a pretty big light blue bar there, that over 21%. That's the Space Force. The reason why that bar is so big is because the Space Force is fairly new. So we're only looking at an FY21 to FY24 time frame there, and they've had explosive growth in their RDT&E funding, and for good reason. Now, if you were to combine that with the Air Force data just next to it, it would equal out to about 12%, more on par with the Army, Navy, and defense-wide funding over the FY15 to FY24 period. Now, those dark blue boxes, that's the really interesting stuff. So that's the future funding. What is that funding doing for each of these services? And you'll notice that for every branch except for the Air Force, the RDT&E funding is actually expected to go downward. And that's part of that transition that I talked about earlier, where funding is shifting from research to then procurement. But the Air Force, they like to be different, and that's okay. They're still funding research and development and prioritizing that, especially as they work on some of these really expensive these projects like Sentinel and NGAD, Next Generation Air Dominance. Okay, so let's move on to our next slide. Another colorful chart for you. This is an area chart, and this is looking at really the same data, the same trends, but this is broken down by categories. So what are the really interesting categories that are receiving the most funding? And apologize for the small font. Hopefully you can read that. But that aqua color at the bottom, that is space funding. So that has and will continue to be a really important category that's going to receive quite a bit of funding all the way out through the FYDP or Future Year Defense Program that next 5 years. So that's to be expected. That dark blue category, that's fixed wing combat aircraft. And if you're familiar with fixed wing combat aircraft, you know that NGAD, Next Generation Air Dominance, that requires a lot of funding. That's a big research project. And we do expect that funding to continue to trend upward, even though there's been some debate about the future of that program. But the data that we looked at from the government shows that that funding is expected to continue. Now that gray box, the gray color and the light blue color, that's air and missile defense for the gray. Light blue is missiles. We separated those out. You can think of it as offensive versus defensive missiles to oversimplify. But one thing I really want to point out is that light blue, that after FY24, that light blue area actually shrinks down. And you might wonder, hey, why is that happening? Well, the biggest reason behind that is the Sentinel ICBM program that is going to shift from research dollars to procurement dollars. Now that last color at the top of the area chart, that is communications and computers. The sixth area on the chart that didn't quite make it in was command and control. You could almost combine those together, but we split them out because we wanted to highlight just the top 5. But the main reason why communications and computers has made it onto our top 5, that's largely driven by JADC2, or that need for investment in communications as we still build out that capability. JADC2, if you're not familiar, Joint All-Domain Command and Control, but if you're in this room, I imagine you're probably familiar with that acronym, one of many. Okay, so now on to my second to last slide. We're just looking at the top line items by service for just FY25. And I'm using the same color pattern as a previous slide, where that light blue, that is going to be the Air Force, purple Space Force, orange is defense-wide, green is Army, and that navy color is the Navy and Marine Corps. So again, only the top 3 line items for each service made it into this chart. But unsurprisingly, Air Force and Space Force are towards the top. You'll recognize some familiar terms there: ground-based strategic defense for FY25. That's the Sentinel program. That's receiving quite a bit of funding, or expected to in FY25. Next Generation Air Dominance, which we've mentioned multiple times, is also number 2. It's also high up on that list, followed by the B-21 long-range strike bomber. Then Space Force, unsurprisingly towards the top again. Satellites going out into low Earth orbit, or LEO, is a big priority for the Space Force. Creating that proliferated network of architecture, really important that continues to get funding as we build out that capability. And I won't go through every single bar on this chart, because I know you can all read, or hopefully you can read that font. But one thing I do want to point out is that green bar in the middle for the Army, that is for future vertical lift, if you're familiar with that. That is a big funding opportunity for the Army there. But I'll go ahead and move on because I only have so much time and hit my my last chart for you here. Basically a simple chart, but I wanted to make sure that we cover emerging technologies because this is the Defense One Tech Summit after all. So what this chart is showing is the top 5 categories that our clients were most interested in that received the most funding in FY25 or our plan 2. So a lot of these are going to be very familiar: hypersonics, cybersecurity, electronic warfare, AI, directed energy, all topics that have come up throughout this event today. Now, you'll notice that they're receiving quite a bit of funding in FY25, but I do want to highlight that second column there, that total FYDP, and that's the funding that each one of these categories is expected to receive over the next 5 years. So every single one of these items here is going to receive over $1 billion in the next 5 years. And another key thing to point out is that cybersecurity is actually going to jump, or is expected to jump above hypersonics over the next 5 years. Before I wrap up, I want to touch on the fact that there's probably a lot that could have been on this list, but just isn't receiving as much funding yet. Things like drone warfare or counter-UAS operations, which as an analyst, I do think that the funding for that is going to increase over time, but unfortunately, they just didn't have the dollars to combine together to get on this chart. But do keep an eye out for funding in those categories moving forward, as that becomes a critical part of the future of modern combat. There we go. Okay, so that brings me to the end of this presentation. If you have questions on our slides, or if you want more information on this topic or topics like it, please visit forecastinternational.com, or please reach out to myself. My colleague Giovanna is in the room. She's our sales rep. She'd be happy to talk with you about how our operations work and what kind of things we can do for you. And also just a shout out to my colleague Sean McDougall, who does focus on U.S. budget data. He is based in Florida, so he couldn't be here today. I'm presenting on his behalf essentially, but he did help me build out the slides, and our contact information is up there on the slides for you all to see. So please definitely reach out. We'd love to get in touch with you and answer any questions about the information that you might have. And with that, there's just a few minutes left, but I'm going to go ahead and hand it back over to my Defense One colleagues. I don't want to keep the keynote speaker waiting. So thank you all very much for your time. It's been my pleasure, and enjoy the last speaker of the evening. Thank you.